1989 looked promising for the four 16-bit platforms. Amiga and Atari, well, they were healthy. PC came up while Apple introduced new models every year. But there were dark clouds invisible for the leaders of two companies. Welcome everybody. If you're interested what happened with Atari and Amiga, how they failed, join me for this video. As I already mentioned, 1989 looked promising for all the platforms. There were more and more programs for Amiga, especially games. Atari was doing quite good, while the other two just proceed. So what happened in 98? Atari introduced an upgrade for the ST line. The STE was not a big step forward. They kept the original CPU. I do not think it was a good choice. What they did, they pumped up the color palette so it was able to handle more colors, but not at the same time. The original screen mode, so for example 320 by 200 with 16 colors, it was not changed. But they improved the sound system, so at this point there was a stereo digital analog converter, and it was somewhat in pair with the Amiga, so it was able to produce good sound from this point. Also, they made it possible to upgrade the memory with 9-bit memory modules, so the C modules used for the PCs. If you have an STE with half megabyte of memory, it is very easy to pump it up to 4 megabytes. At this point they made the blitter as a default stuff, but unfortunately, because of the big install base of the original machine, it was not really utilized by games. My biggest problem with this machine is the CPU, because it was not changed. They kept the original Motorola CPU. It was not even pumped up in frequency, for example to 16 MHz, which is a little bit strange. There was no new Commodore machine in this year, but Irving Gaud handed over the CEO position to Mehdi Ali. At this point I don't know what to say, because if Gaud was bad, then Mehdi Ali was even worse. Apple followed the small step strategy. They introduced the new model, the 2CI. It had a faster CPU, so at this point it was running at 25 MHz. I think it was to mention their first laptop model, so it was the portable. Even if it was not a 100% successful model, they could use it as a base model and then improve it step by step. If you remember what happened with the Macintosh, it was not really good, but they developed it further when they added extra memory and then the SCSI controller whatsoever, so they had this kind of tradition at Apple. I think these small evolutionary steps paid out for them. The IBM compatible machines really stepped forward. At this point, Intel was able to ship the 386 CPUs running at 33 MHz. Additionally, they introduced a new model. The first 486 CPUs were available in April, but what is really stunning, if you open Byte magazine this year, for example in November, you will find their tests as well as advertisements. It took less than a half year for the clone makers to release a computer based on the new CPU. This is a really fast development cycle. Additionally, the new CPU just pushed down the price of the older models. For example, it was possible to buy a Dell computer based on 286 running at 12 MHz, 1 MB of RAM, some HDD and color VGA monitor for less than $2,000. I already mentioned Covox and Adlib in the previous video, and in this year Sound Blaster introduced their first sound card. I can say that the IBM PC started to close the technological gap, or even on few areas pull ahead of Amiga and Atari. 1990 started with the good news for Amiga, Atari and Apple. In January, Motorola started to ship their first 6040 CPUs. Those processors were competitors for the 486 CPUs, but also they were late by 8 months. This year Atari released the TT, but to be honest I'm not really satisfied with this one. It is using a 68030 CPU running at 16 MHz. I can say that it was not a match for the new PCs, because it was not as fast as a 386, and do not mention the 486 based machines. Commodore finally introduced a new model, the 3000. I'm not particularly happy with this one, even if I like it. The biggest issue with this model is again the CPU. They released it with a 68030 running at 16 or 25 MHz, but again I can say that it was not a match for a PC sporting a 486. The A3000 introduced two new things. The first one is the ECS, so the enhanced chipset. It is really just enhanced compared to the original chipset, and it was not a big step forward. There was no change on the sound side. They implemented only two major changes. First of all, they increased the chip memory from half megabyte to 1 megabyte, and they introduced new production graphics modes, but there was no radical change. As I mentioned in the chip memory, so this is the memory area where you need to store the screen and the sound handled by the chipset. It is possible to add fast memory to the computer. This is handled directly by the CPU. I think it is easier if I show you a picture about the architecture of the Amiga to understand why do we need to talk about these two memory types. The chip memory is handled by the chipset. It means the CPU is sharing the bandwidth with the chipset. Since the developers were not able to change the chipset because Mehdi Ali gave the instruction no new chip, it started to become a bottleneck. What do I mean bottleneck? Simply if you want to increase the screen size as well as the color depth, you have to transfer more data from the RAM. There are multiple ways to handle this bottleneck. First of all, it is possible to increase the width of the data bus, for example from 16 to 32 bits. And there is another solution to increase the speed. So for example, raise it from 7 MHz to 40 MHz. But because of the no change policy, the developers were not able to eliminate this bottleneck. Beside the ECS chipset, there was the new Amiga OS 2, which introduced new features compared to the 1.3, but also it had issues. I will talk about those issues when we reach the Amiga 500 Plus. If I talk about Apple, I think it will be a bit boring. They just pumped up again the CPU speed. So the Macintosh 2FX was running on 40 MHz. Maybe it is a bit more interesting to talk about the 2SI. It was a new medium-range computer, so they introduced new models somewhere between the classic all-in-one Macintosh and the top 2FX. In my opinion, it was a wise move. That way they had a palette from the low end till the high end. The evolution of IBM compatibles was running forward. In this year, Intel shipped 486 running on 33 MHz. It sounds a small step forward, but if you calculate the 25 MHz versus 33 MHz, it means an increase of 33%. Today we would be happy to see such movement year by year. What is more important is the software side. Microsoft introduced the new Windows 3.0. It was not the best, but it was a big jump from Windows 2.0. Let's say this version started to be good enough. With 1991, we are reaching the point of no return. You will see what happened this year, and I'll try to give you some insights why those things happened. Atari released the Mega STE. It still used the old 68000 CPU from Motorola. It was running at 60 MHz, but it was too slow at that point. The 2 to 4 megabyte memory, well, it was good enough, but nothing special. How could it happen? I think the reason behind is Tramiel. Tramiel handled the computers as consumer products. His previous experience on the typewriters and calculators somewhat made him incompetent in this area. He was not able to see the importance of software and continuous development. The problem here, they released only cheap computers. It's a kind of catch-22. If you release not fast enough computers, there will be not enough software. If there is not enough software, no one will buy a computer, then the sales are going down, and then even less sales, etc., etc. So it's a kind of catch-22. But Commodore, and especially Mehdi Ali, was not better. They released the new Amiga, it was the 500 Plus, with the new Amiga OS and the ECS chipset. After the release, they faced incompatibility issues. It was caused by the programmers because they started to use unofficial entry points to the Amiga OS 1.3 instead of using APIs. In my previous video, I mentioned at Apple, they forced to use those API, and that way they were able to switch from the original Mac Classic to the Mac 2 series and then step forward. At Commodore, at least officially, they were not aware of the importance of that. They also released the CD-TV. Unfortunately, it was not a successful product. There was a similar system from Philips, the CDI, and none of them were really successful. I think they were too early. There was not enough content, games, videos for those platforms. Especially if we check out the price level, because CD-TV in fact was an Amiga 500 with a CD-ROM, and it was possible to expand it to a full computer. But in this case, the cost of the CD-TV with all the thingies was too high. But I promised an example to you, which is pointing what was the problem with the management and foreseeing at Commodore. There was an Amiga 3000 variant, the A3000UX. Sun approached Commodore to make a deal. Their plan was that to sell the A3000UX as a Unix workstation branded as a Sun computer. But Mehdi Ali failed to make this deal. Can you believe that someone is approaching you to sell something and you fail to sell it? I think it is just insane. If we switch to Apple, I can repeat just myself. Finally, they released the Quadra series. It was using the new Motorola 60040. They were falling behind the IBM compatibles by around 18 months. There was also a new system variant, the System 7. The System 7 was developed up to 97, so it was a long-standing version, and it is a quite stable one. If you have a Mac 2 with a faster Motorola CPU, I can really recommend one of its variants. We are reaching 1992, and this is the year what I tend to mention as not enough, too late. Atari released the Falcon. Again, they used an outdated CPU, a 68030 running at 16 MHz. Additionally, they reduced the data bus to 16 bits. I cannot find words how could they do that. It's just, let's say, insane. Okay, I know it had a DSP and new screen modes, but to be honest, I don't know what they were thinking of. It's just not enough. Commodore released multiple new machines, and they had at least a plan, but this plan was also flawed. If we check them out from bottom up, first of all, they released the 600. The original name was 300 because the plan was to have a cheap machine, but they failed because of some kind of over-engineering. The A600 is a repackaged 500 Plus. It has the same ECS chipset, 1 MB of memory, and Amiga OS 204. Until this point, it sounds like a cost-reduced version, but then they started to add more features. First of all, it is able to handle hard drives, which is a good idea, but it must be inside the case, so it can handle only laptop 2.5-inch hard drives. Those kind of hard drives were really expensive that time. I don't know why, but they included a PCMC slot as expansion port. It was anything but not cheap. On top of that, they switched over SMD. All in all, at the end, the price of the 600 was more than the 500 Plus. The Amiga 1200 model got an advanced chipset. The original plan was to release with advanced architecture chipset, but they failed with that, so they released it with the advanced graphics architecture. This new chipset, in one hand, was really a big step forward, and in the other hand, it was really disappointing. Why do I say it was a step forward? Because they implemented what I already mentioned. So they stepped from 16-bit wide data bus to 32, and they increased the speed from 7 MHz to 14 MHz. That way, it had 4 times more bandwidth. It made it possible to have a resolution of 640 by 480, so the standard VGA resolution, with 256 colors. On the other hand, there was no change on the sound side. With these parameters, there was one problem. That time, on IBM PC compatible side, the Super VGA started to become common. What does it mean? It means the new Windows accelerator cards were able to produce a picture up to 1024 by 768. Additionally, they made the same mistake on the CPU side as before. The Motorola 68020 running at 14 MHz was anything but not fast. Okay, I know the whole machine was fast enough to run games, but it was not really future-proof. You may also say that it is possible to install some kind of turbo card. Yes, that's true, but if you install a turbo card, in this case you lose the price advantage of the Amiga. I tend to say the 1200 was a good machine. Its biggest problem was the timing. It was released in 92 instead of 1990. The third machine, the 4000, was the big new box model. It was built around the same chipset as the 1200. On CPU side, the 60040 running at 25 MHz was available, and other parameters were really promising, Zorro 3 bus, 32-bit SIMs, etc. But to be honest, it was too late. They were able to sell only a few thousand of those machines because the IBM PCs with the new Intel CPUs were faster and sometimes even cheaper. They left only a small niche market for the Amiga 4000. But unfortunately, on top of that, there were more issues. The first one, ironically, was the Commodore management. It was a time when they started to have a cash flow problem. What do I mean cash flow problem? Before Christmas, you have to order in time the models you want to sell. If you do not have enough money, you are not able to sell enough computers during the Christmas period. And what they did, they ordered those 600s instead of the 1200s. And as usual, people looked for the new model, so there were a heap of 600s, unsold heap, while they were running out of the stock of 1200s. The other issue was external, but before of that, let me talk about Apple. What Apple did is just the standard stuff. They increased the speed of the CPU. The new Quadra 950 had a CPU running at 33 MHz. So after this short interrupt, back to the IBM compatibles. There was a price war between the clone makers. There was a dispute between Intel and AMD, but finally Intel lost on court and AMD started to ship their own 386 variants. An AM386 running at 40 MHz was approximately as fast as a 486 running at 25 MHz. Why is it important? Because they were way cheaper. If it is not enough, Cyrix also released its variant. They called it 486 DLC and SLC. Okay, they were not real 486 CPUs, but for the same price it was possible to buy faster machines. If I was hesitating to say good enough for Windows 3.0, the 3.1 was a real hit. Together with Microsoft Office, was really in pair with Atari, Apple, and a little bit of Amiga. Amiga OS, especially the new variant, so the Amiga OS 3, was better, but as I already mentioned, economically it is enough if you are good enough and big enough. The programmers will develop more program and then you will sell more and more and more. In this video, 93 is the last year I will mention, but I try to include the rest as well. What happened in this year? Well, Atari was really just fading out. I don't know what else to say about it. They tried to release a console, the Jaguar, but it failed in 93. I think that's it. Commodore also failed. They tried to release CD32, which was a successor of CD-TV based on the Amiga 1200, but again they failed with the stocking issue. They had not enough money to build a big enough stock, and finally they had to close the business in 94. A German company, the ESCOM, bought the intellectual property as well as the Amiga. They started to ship it again, but they went bankrupt in 96. Amiga is still alive. There is a flourishing community around it. Beside the community, there are multiple companies and they're still releasing hardware and software for these machines. It is possible to pump up a machine to a crazy speed, and also you can find new Amiga OS releases, so it is retired but still alive. The Apple had its own crisis. It had two reasons. The first was the CPU, but they managed to switch over from the Motorola CPUs to the new PowerPC series. The long-standing System 7 version helped them out in this case, But it caused another issue. They failed to renew the operating system. As far as I remember, they had 2 different projects to have a successor, but finally Apple approached NeXT, which was not doing well at the time, and it was the point when Jobs returned to Apple. Steve Jobs was able to capture the CEO position, so finally he became the leader of Apple. Under his wing, they released the new series of Apple computers, and in 2000 the OS X. They managed to keep the backward compatibility. That way they had no problem with the software library. If we take a look at the Apple portfolio, then it is easy to say how they survived. Simply they invested enough into R&D, and even if they never invented something brand new like the Apple Lisa and then the Macintosh, they were able to keep up with the MS-DOS based IBM PC compatibles. If we are talking about the PCs, in 93 Intel released the Pentium, in 95 there was the Windows 95, so this platform really developed very fast. Of course there was room for development. I did not say it was the best, but the race between different companies really pushed it much faster than the other 3. At this point I'm reaching the end of this video, but before closing, let's check out few games. I would like to compare few titles between Amiga and the IBM compatibles, just to show how the PCs catch the Amiga. The first game is the Frontier. It makes possible to compare the old platforms, so the 68000 based Atari STE and Amiga 600 with the Amiga 1200 and the 386SX running on 40 MHz. It is easy to say the 2 old machines were really outdated in 93. The 1200 and the 386 were able to manage the program somehow. Because of that, I'm comparing just the 1200 with the 386SX in the next test. ESCOM was a very good turn-based strategy game. It is trafficking the graphics, the sound, as well as the CPU. If I compare the graphics, I tend to say they are on the same ballpark. I a little bit prefer the Amiga sound, but I really miss the music during the enemy movement. But there is a problem with the Amiga 1200. The 68020 is not fast enough. The small 386 is also somewhat slow, but the Amiga is really sluggish. It means too many hiccups, stops, breaks. It's just too sluggish to really make the game enjoyable. Additionally, to avoid disk swapping, I had to install it on hard drive. But the base machine has just 2 MB of chip RAM, so I had to create a boot disk. It is necessary because that way the game can use the whole memory. To avoid that, I could install some fast RAM, like 4 MB of fast RAM or a turbo card, but in this case I'm losing the price performance advantage of the 1200. But step forward and check out Aladdin from 94. This game really suits the Amiga. These machines were excellent for such kind of platform games and shooters, where it is necessary to move the screen and at the same time have a nice sound. This is a title where Amiga really excels. Unfortunately, at that time there was already a game which changed the balance. Today we call such games as first-person shooters. Many people consider Doom as the killer game which really attracted people and developers towards PC. But there was before the Wolfenstein. I would like to credit it as well. Okay, the graphics and the sound was not as good as the Doom, but it was an evolutionary step for ID Software. Let's switch over to Doom. It introduced not just good graphics and pretty decent sound, but as well as multiplayer over local network. As you can see, the 386SX is not capable enough to deal with this software. When it was introduced, it required really a powerhouse, so a 486, to run properly. I don't know how, but we played with this one several hours, and I think, as you can see, even if I reduce the screen size radically, the frame per second is really very sluggish. I don't know how we spent hours with that one. In the next video I will check out the possibilities and alternatives from this era. I hope you enjoyed this video. Join me for the next one. Goodbye.